The iron shackles bit into Sarah's wrists as she stood on the auction platform in Natchez. 23 years old, strong. Back, good teeth. The auctioneer's voice droned numbers that translated to human worth. Men circled her like vultures, calculating profit margins in their heads. But Thomas Whitmore wasn't looking at her the way other buyers did. His eyes held something darker than the usual calculation of field hands and house servants, something that made her skin crawl even in the suffocating July heat. He paid $300 more than the highest bid. The auctioneer's gavel fell like a death sentence. Your support ensures these voices are finally heard. The Whitmore plantation sprawled across 12,200 acres of Mississippi bottomland. Cotton stretched to the horizon in neat rows that represented fortunes built on stolen labor and broken bodies. The big house stood white and imposing, its columns reaching toward a sky that seemed to turn away from what happened. Beneath it, paint gleamed fresh under the brutal summer sun, maintained by the labor of people who would never own anything, not even themselves. Sarah arrived in chains on a Tuesday morning, when the heat already shimmered off the dirt roads. Dust coated everything, trees lining the property, the fence, posts marking boundaries, the faces of field hands who paused briefly to watch another soul enter their collective nightmare. The overseer, a thin man named Curthurst with skin like tanned leather and eyes that had learned not to see too much, barely glanced at her papers before pointing toward the quarters. Rough Hune cabins lined a clearing behind the cotton gin. Smoke rose from cooking fires where women prepared the evening meal after 14 hours. In the fields, children too young to work played in the dirt with sticks and stones, their games mimicking the only world they knew. Old men and women sat on steps, bodies used up by decades of labor, waiting for death to release them from a system that had consumed their entire lives. But Sarah never made it to those cabins. Thomas Whitmore intercepted her at the property line, his horse kicking up dust as he rode down from the big house. He was 47 years old, with a particular cruelty that came from inheriting wealth rather than earning it. His father had built the plantation from raw land and borrowed capital. His grandfather had fought in the Revolution, returned with stories of freedom and liberty that somehow never extended to the people he enslaved. Thomas merely maintained what others created, and that knowledge had curdled inside him into something toxic. He dismounted without speaking to Sarah directly. She was property now, and property didn't require conversation. He spoke to Curthurst in low tones, gesturing toward a structure that stood separate from the other buildings. The overseer's face registered something that might have been objection, but he nodded and turned away. Men like Curthurst survived by not asking questions. The breeding barn stood separate from the other structures, isolated by 50 yards of clear ground. Most plantations had them, though few spoke openly about their purpose. This one was newer than the rest, built just 2 years prior from cypress wood that still smelled of sap and swamp water. The boards fit together tightly, professional construction that suggested significant investment. Windows were sparse and set high, providing ventilation but preventing anyone inside from seeing out. Inside, the air hung thick with the scent of hay and animal fear. The space was larger than it appeared from outside, divided into sections with heavy wooden partitions. Stalls lined one wall, storage for feed and equipment occupied another. A small room had been constructed in the far corner, barely larger than a closet, with a door that locked from the outside. Whitmore kept his prize bull there, a massive Hereford named Caesar, imported from England at considerable expense 3 years prior. The animal represented progress, modernity, scientific agriculture. Whitmore had attended lectures in New Orleans about improving livestock through selective breeding. He subscribed to agricultural journals from Virginia and Kentucky. He corresponded with breeders across the South, discussing bloodlines and genetic improvement with the fervor of a true believer. The bull weighed nearly 2,000 pounds. Its coat was deep reddish-brown, muscles moving beneath the hide like machinery designed by nature itself. Caesar had proven his value by siring calves that sold for premium prices across 3 counties. Strong bloodlines, desirable traits, superior characteristics passed from parent to offspring, the exact qualities that had given Whitmore his terrible idea. He looked at Sarah with the same analytical gaze he used on his cattle. Height, weight, musculature, physical characteristics that might, in his twisted reasoning, combine with the bull's traits to create something new, something unprecedented, something that would make him famous in agricultural circles and solve his plantation's labor challenges forever. The theory had formed in his mind over months of reading and observation. If animals could be improved through breeding, why not humans? If desirable traits in livestock could be enhanced through careful selection and controlled mating, surely the same principles applied to his labor force. The scientific journal spoke of heredity, of passing characteristics from parent to offspring, of manipulation of bloodlines to achieve specific outcomes. But Thomas Whitmore had taken these agricultural principles and twisted them into something monstrous, something that violated every natural law while hiding behind the language of science and progress. He believed that by forcing a woman to mate with his prize bull, he could create offspring that combined human intelligence with animal strength, workers who would never tire, slaves who could labor from dawn until midnight without complaint or resistance. The perfect merger of man and beast, of cognition and physical power, all wrapped in flesh that he would own completely. It was pseudoscience built on racism and cruelty, evil dressed in the language of agricultural improvement, madness given legitimacy by a society that had already decided certain people weren't fully human. But in 1843, Mississippi, where the law protected property rights above all else, and the enslaved had no recourse to justice, who would stop him? Sarah stood in that barn, for the first time understanding nothing except that something terrible was about to begin. The bull shifted in, its stall massive and indifferent to the human drama unfolding nearby. Its breathing was deep and rhythmic, occasionally interrupted by snorts or the stamp of hooves against packed earth. Whitmore circled her slowly, already planning the experiments that would consume the next year of both their lives. He spoke as if she wasn't there, thinking aloud about methodology and variables, about timing and environmental factors, about all the considerations that went into successful breeding of livestock. What he would do defied nature itself. What Sarah would endure tested the limits of human survival, and the blame he would place when his mad science failed would reveal the depths of his depravity. The breeding barn door closed behind them, with the finality of a tomb being sealed. Whitmore kept detailed records. He had learned that much from his agricultural reading. Every breeding experiment required documentation, careful notes about conditions and outcomes, methodical tracking of variables and results. Scientific credibility depended on proper record keeping. He purchased a leather-bound ledger specifically for this purpose, its pages thick and cream-colored, suitable for what he considered important scientific work. Sarah's name appeared on the first page with a date and a clinical description that reduced her humanity to measurements and potential variables. Height 5 feet 6 inches, weight approximately 130 pounds, age 23 years, physical condition excellent, previous births none recorded. He wrote with the precise handwriting of an educated man, each letter carefully formed as if elegant. penmanship might somehow legitimize the horror he was documenting. The barn became her prison. The small room in the corner held nothing but a straw mattress and a chamber pot. No window except the ventilation gaps near the ceiling where sunlight entered in thin streams that moved across the floor as hours passed. The door locked from the outside with a heavy iron bolt. She could hear the bull moving in its stall throughout the day. At night, its breathing deep and rhythmic, occasionally interrupted by snorts or the stamp of hooves when something disturbed its rest. Whitmore visited every morning at dawn. He would arrive as mist still clung to the fields, visible through the high windows, as pale ghosts dissolving in early light. He never touched Sarah himself. That wasn't part of his design. He viewed himself as a scientist conducting an experiment, and scientists maintained professional distance from their subjects. He would stand outside the stall where Caesar was kept, studying the animal with an expression that combined satisfaction and anticipation. He explained his theory to Sarah in the clinical tone of a lecturer addressing students at an agricultural college. The human body was merely another form of livestock subject to the same natural laws that governed all breeding. Principles that improve cattle would naturally improve slaves. Through careful experimentation and proper application of selective breeding techniques, he would create a new type of worker, stronger, more resilient, requiring less food and rest. The perfect economic unit that would révolutioniser Plantation agriculture across the entire South. Sarah said, nothing. What words existed for this kind of madness? What response could penetrate the delusion of a man who had convinced himself that the impossible was merely unprecedented? She had learned years ago that silence was often the only form of resistance available to the enslaved. So she remained quiet, conserving her strength, her mind already beginning the process of separating itself from what was about to happen to her body. If you're still watching, leave a comment below. These historical accounts matter. They cannot be forgotten. Your engagement helps these stories reach more people. The first attempt happened on a Thursday morning when the temperature had already climbed past 90 degrees. Whitmore had prepared the space carefully, reading his notes multiple times, ensuring all variables were controlled to his satisfaction. He had studied animal husbandry extensively through journals and correspondence with other breeders. He knew how livestock handlers position animals, how they timed the breeding process, what environmental factors affected success rates in cattle and horses. He tried to apply these principles to something that violated every natural law. The bull was led from its stall with considerable effort, arrangement, some violation of instinct that made the animal bulk and pull against the lead. But Whitmore and Curthers, who had been summoned to assist, despite his obvious discomfort, managed to move the massive creature into the breeding area. Sarah was forced into the same space. What happened next existed beyond the boundaries of human language. The screams that erupted from the barn could be heard across the plantation. Field hands working half a mile away stopped their labor, sweat freezing on their backs despite the Mississippi heat. They knew those sounds. They understood what they meant even without details. Women working near the big house felt their stomachs turn. Old men, who had survived decades of brutality, felt tears on their faces. No one spoke of it. No one dared. The system had taught them that intervention meant death. The experiment failed as nature demanded it must. Caesar showed no interest in anything except returning to his stall and the feed trough. The animal's instincts recognized that what Whitmore proposed defied every biological imperative coded into millions of years of evolution. The bull simply stood there, massive and indifferent, occasionally shifting weight from one foot to another, waiting for this strange disruption to end. But Whitmore blamed Sarah. His carefully maintained records that evening included detailed notes about how the subject had failed to cooperate, had somehow sabotaged the process through resistance or unspecified deficiencies in her constitution. His handwriting grew more erratic as frustration bled into the clinical language. The failure couldn't be his fault. The theory was sound. The methodology was correct. Therefore, the problem must lie with the subject herself. He would try again and again and again. The attempts continued throughout July and into August with disturbing regularity. Whitmore adjusted variables with each failure, treating the experiments like agricultural trials that simply needed better calibration. Different times of day, dawn, noon, evening, searching for some optimal moment when nature might somehow comply with his madness. Different preparations of the space, the animals, the positioning. He consulted his breeding manuals obsessively, searching for techniques that might make the impossible somo possible. His frustration grew with each unsuccessful attempt, and that frustration expressed itself as increasing cruelty towards Sarah. She received less food, 1 meal per day of cornmeal and scraps that wouldn't sustain a child, much less a woman enduring repeated trauma. Less water provided in a small bucket that had to last from morning until the next dawn. The logic was simple in his mind. Animals performed better when hungry, when desperate, when survival itself became motivation. Perhaps deprivation would make her more compliant, more suitable for his purposes. The other slaves knew. Information traveled through the corridors in whispers, and meaningful glances exchanged over work. In the fields, they had seen Sarah briefly on the day she arrived, a young woman with intelligent eyes and a bearing that suggested she hadn't yet been completely broken by the system. Then she disappeared into the breeding barn and never emerged. Her screams punctuated their days. Her absence haunted their nights. The knowledge of what was happening just beyond their line of sight added another layer of horror to lives already saturated with suffering. But resistance meant death. Speaking out meant the whip or worse. Showing sympathy might draw Whitmore's attention to you, might make you the next subject in his experiments. So they worked their fields and tended their tasks and carried the weight of knowing what was happening while being powerless to stop it. By September, Whitmore had attempted his experiment 17 times. 17 sessions documented in his ledger with scientific precision. 17 failures that he attributed entirely to Sarah's deficiencies rather than the fundamental impossibility of his design. His anger was building like storm clouds on the horizon. His wounded pride festered and infected his judgment, and wounded pride in a man with absolute power over another human being was perhaps the most dangerous thing in Annabella, Mississippi. Curthurst had worked as overseer on the Whitmore plantation for 6 years. He had seen cruelty in forms that would have shocked the version of himself who first arrived from South Carolina, young, ambitious, convinced that hard work and loyalty would lead to something better. The system had educated him thoroughly in brutality's many expressions. He had wielded the whip himself when Whitmore demanded it, had separated families when economics required it, had looked away from violations that would have disgusted his younger self. But this was different. This crossed boundaries he didn't even know he possessed. He stood outside the breeding barn on a September morning when autumn should have brought relief from the heat, but hadn't. The air remained thick and oppressive, promising storms that never came. Inside the barn, sounds emerged that made his stomach turn and his hands shake. Sounds that invaded his sleep and made him reach for whiskey before noon. Whatever was happening inside that structure went beyond the normal operations of a plantation, beyond the usual violence that maintained the system. This was something else entirely, something that disturb him in ways he couldn't quite articulate even to himself. Curthurst was 34 years old, raised poor in the hills of South Carolina, where his family had scratched subsistence from rocky soil. He'd been educated just enough to read ledgers and write reports, skills that had lifted him above the dirt farmers and mill workers he'd grown up among. The overseer position represented the pinnacle of what someone like him could achieve, managing other men's property, earning a salary that allowed him to send money back to his widowed mother, maintaining a position of relative authority. He told himself repeatedly that his discomfort was impractical, sentimental, the luxury of people who didn't understand how the world actually worked. This was business. Whitmore owned his property and could do with it as he pleased. The law said so explicitly. Society agreed at every level, from the church pulpit to the courthouse steps. Every institution affirmed that the enslaved were property, not people, and property rights were sacred above all else. But the screams made his hands shake, and the shaking made him angry at himself for being weak. He had tried not to think too deeply about what Whitmore was attempting in that barn. Better not to know details, better to maintain plausible ignorance that might protect whatever remained of his conscience. But the sounds made ignorance impossible, and the looks from the other slaves, a mixture of terror and accusation, reminded him daily that he was complicit in something monstrous. His wife had died 2 years earlier from yellow fever, convulsing in their bed while he held her hand and prayed uselessly. His 2 children lived with his sister in Charleston, growing up with an uncle they barely remembered. He was alone with his thoughts and his growing horror at what his job required him to tolerate. That afternoon, Curthurst found himself walking toward the plantation office without consciously deciding to do so. His feet carried him forward, while his mind screamed warnings about the consequences of what he was about to attempt. Whitmore sat at his desk, reviewing cotton prices in the New Orleans papers, occasionally making notes in the margins. The master looked up from his reading with mild annoyance. At the interruption, Curthurst chose his words with the care of a man walking through a minefield. He spoke of practical concerns, not moral ones. The other slaves were disturbed by the noises from the barn, he explained. Work efficiency had decreased measurably over the past 2 months. Several hands had been found standing idle, staring in the direction of the breeding facility when they should have been picking cotton. Productivity numbers were declining at a time when the harvest demanded maximum output. Whitmore listened with the expression of a man hearing complaints about trivial inconveniences. The experiment was important work, he explained in the patient tone one might use with a slow child. Progress required sacrifice. Scientific advancement always disturbed those too ignorant to understand its necessity. If the other slaves were disturbed, then discipline them, apply the whip, reduce rations, do whatever was necessary to restore proper behavior. That was what overseers were paid to accomplish. Curthurst pressed further, crossing a line he rarely approached with his employer. He suggested carefully, respectfully, that perhaps the experiment had run its course. 6 months of attempts with no results. Maybe it was time to acknowledge that success was unlikely. Maybe Sarah could be assigned to field work or house duties like any other slave. Maybe they could return to normal plantation operations. The temperature in the room dropped despite the September heat. Whitmore stood slowly, setting aside his newspaper with deliberate care. His voice remained calm, almost gentle, which somehow made his words more threatening. The experiment would continue as long as he deemed necessary. His judgment on such matters. Employees. The breeding program represented important research that would revolutionize Southern agriculture. Any overseer who couldn't support such vital work clearly lacked the vision necessary for continued employment. And if Curthurst found his duties too challenging, Whitmore continued with icy precision. There were plenty of men in Natchez who would gladly take his position, men without excessive sentiment, men who understood that progress sometimes required uncomfortable measures, men who recognized that property owners had absolute rights over their property. The message was clear: remain silent or lose everything. Kurthurst left without another word, his face burning with shame and anger that had nowhere to go except inward. He walked back to his small cabin near the big house, poured whiskey with shaking hands, and sat on the porch staring at nothing. The truth behind stories like Sarah's has been buried for generations. By staying until the end, you help ensure these voices are finally heard. Your support matters more than you know. The system had trapped him as surely as it trapped those who worked the fields. Not in the same way. He understood that crucial difference with painful clarity. He could leave. He could walk away tomorrow, find another position, return to South Carolina, and start over. He had choices, however limited and unpleasant, but leaving meant poverty, meant crawling back to his sister's charity with nothing to show for 6 years of work, meant admitting failure to everyone who had watched him climb to this position of relative authority, meant explaining to his children why he couldn't provide for them anymore, why they would grow up even poorer than he had. So he stayed. He told himself that he was simply doing his job, following orders, maintaining operations. He convinced himself that his presence might somehow moderate Whitmore's worst impulses, though he had no evidence this was true. He constructed elaborate justifications that although the mental gymnastics that allowed complicit people to sleep at night. Meanwhile, in the breeding barn, Sarah endured another day of Whitmore's experiments. Her body was failing under the combined assault of malnutrition, trauma, and despair. She had lost significant weight, her clothes hanging loose on a frame that seemed to shrink daily. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor that suggested her body was consuming itself from the inside. Her eyes had developed a 1,000-yard stare that indicated her mind had retreated to some internal place where the present couldn't reach her. But she was still alive, still conscious, still suffering. Whitmore noted her physical decline in his ledger, but attributed it to inherent weaknesses in her constitution rather than the conditions he imposed. His notes grew increasingly frustrated, the handwriting more erratic. With each entry, he had expected results. By now, the breeding journal suggested that proper pairings produced offspring within specific time frames. Why was this different? What variable was he missing? The question never led him to the obvious answer that what he attempted was biologically impossible, that no amount of forced proximity could create offspring between species, separated by millions of years of evolution, that his entire premise was built on pseudoscience and racist delusion rather than actual natural law. His education had been expensive but incomplete. He knew enough science to sound authoritative in plantation social circles, but not enough to recognize the limits of natural law. He understood selective breeding in agricultural context, but had no grasp of the fundamental biology that made cross-species reproduction impossible. So he blamed Sarah for the failures, and blame, in the hands of a powerful man, always found expression through punishment. October arrived with cooler temperatures and the busiest part of the cotton harvest. The plantation operated at maximum capacity. Every available person in the fields from first light until the sun disappeared beyond the tree line. Even children as young as 6 picked cotton until their small fingers bled and their backs cramped from bending. But the breeding barn never stopped its operations. If anything, Whitmore's obsession intensified as the failures mounted. His experiment had transformed from agricultural improvement to personal vendetta. He would make this work through sheer force of will, regardless of what nature or biology insisted was possible. Sarah's suffering became secondary to his need to prove his theory correct. Dr. Harrison Colby maintained a practice in Natchez that catered exclusively to the planter class. He treated their families for various ailments, prescribed remedies for their nerves and digestive complaints, attended births in the big houses where white children entered the world with every advantage. Occasionally, he examined their most valuable slaves when the potential loss of property warranted professional medical attention. Field hands with injuries that threatened their ability to work. House servants whose illnesses might spread to their owners. Whitmore summoned him in late October with a terror message delivered by a writer. Medical consultation required regarding property health. Come immediately. The doctor arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. His medical bag containing the standard implements of 1840s medicine, lancets for bloodletting, bottles of various tinctures, a stethoscope that was still considered modern technology, powders, and compounds that promised relief from dozens of ailments. He expected a routine call, perhaps a house slave with pneumonia or a valuable field hand who had suffered an injury that required amputation to prevent deadly infection. Whitmore met him at the main house and led him directly toward the breeding barn without explanation. They walked in silence across the cleared ground that separated the structure from other buildings. Dr. Colby noticed immediately that this isolation was deliberate. Whatever happened here was meant to be hidden from casual observation. The smell hit him first when Whitmore opened the door. Unwashed human body, animal waste, something else underneath it all that suggested decay and despair, the medical odor of approaching death. His training had exposed him to suffering in various forms: epidemic disease, traumatic injuries, difficult child births that killed mother and infant, both. But this felt different. The air itself seemed contaminated with wrongness. Inside, the barn was darker than the afternoon sunshine outside suggested it would be. High windows provided minimal light. The bull shifted in its stall, massive and indifferent to the human drama. And in the small corner room, Sarah lay on a straw mattress that hadn't been changed in weeks. Dr. Colby had seen slaves in poor condition before. The system produced such casualties with depressing regularity. But this level of deterioration suggested intentional neglect rather than the usual hardships of plantation life. He approached her with professional detachment, years of medical training overriding his personal reactions. She was barely conscious, her breathing shallow and irregular. Her skin had developed open sores from malnutrition and lack of basic hygiene. Severe dehydration had left her lips cracked and bleeding. Her body showed signs of repeated trauma that he couldn't quite categorize. She weighed perhaps 90 pounds now, maybe less. Muscle mass had wasted away, leaving her skeletal. Her eyes opened briefly when he touched her, but they didn't focus on anything in the present moment. He examined her thoroughly while Whitmore watched from the doorway. The doctor's hands were practiced, efficient, documenting her condition with mental notes that would go into a report. Severe malnutrition approaching, starvation, critical dehydration, multiple contusions in various stages of healing, evidence of repeated physical trauma, early signs of organ failure. Without immediate intervention, she would be dead within 2 weeks, possibly sooner. When he finished the examination, Dr. Colby stepped outside with Whitmore. The autumn air felt clean after the barn's faded interior. Overhead, birds called to each other, oblivious to the horror unfolding below. The doctor chose his words with the caution of a man who understood social hierarchies and the dangers of offending powerful clients who paid his bills. The slave was dying, he explained in clinical terms. Multiple organ systems were failing. Without immediate medical intervention, proper food, clean water, rest, hygiene, medication. She wouldn't survive another month. As a matter of protecting his property investment, Whitmore should consider immediate treatment. Whitmore listened without apparent emotion. Then he explained the experiment. Dr. Colby had heard disturbing things in his 20 years of medical practice across 3 southern states. The plantation system produced its share of horrors, and doctors who served that system learned to maintain professional detachment from situations that might otherwise disturb their sleep. Slaves worked to death in the fields, women assaulted by their owners, children sold away from their parents, medical experiments conducted without consent on bodies that legally couldn't refuse. But this made his stomach lurch in ways his professional training couldn't quite suppress. Whitmore described his theory with the confidence of a man who had convinced himself that reading agricultural journals made him a scientific authority. Cross-species breeding, creating hybrid workers, combining human and animal traits. Revolutionary agricultural science that would transform Southern plantation economics. 6 months of experiments. 17 attempts documented in careful detail. No results yet, but surely success was imminent with proper persistence. Dr. Colby stood very still, processing what he was hearing. His medical education at the University of Pennsylvania had included courses in biology and anatomy. He understood reproduction, heredity, the fundamental principles of how living organisms pass traits to offspring. What Whitmore described violated every natural law that governed reproduction. He tried to explain this carefully. Humans and cattle were different species. He said reproduction between them was biologically impossible. The physical mechanisms weren't compatible. No amount of forced proximity would change fundamental genetic realities. The experiment was doomed from its inception by the laws of nature itself. Whitmore's face darkened like clouds before a storm. He didn't appreciate being lectured about science by a country doctor. He had read extensively on the subject. He corresponded with agricultural experts across the South. He understood breeding principles better than most planters in Mississippi. If the experiment hadn't succeeded yet, it was because of deficiencies in the subject, not flaws in his methodology. These historical truths are difficult to hear, but they must be told. Leave a comment if you're still with Sarah's story. Your engagement helps more people learn this history. Dr. Colby found himself at a moral crossroads that he'd avoided throughout his medical career. He could report what he had witnessed to authorities, but the authorities in Natchez were either related to the planter class or economically dependent on them. The sheriff was Whitmore's cousin. The judge had borrowed money from Whitmore's bank. The law explicitly protected property rights above all else. Whitmore was doing nothing illegal. Under Mississippi law, slaves were property and owners could treat their property however they wished. He could refuse future calls to the plantation, but that would merely ensure no medical professionals witnessed what was happening, and refusing a client as wealthy and connected as Whitmore could damage his practice irreparably. Word would spread through the planter community. Other wealthy families might decline his services. His income and reputation depended on maintaining good relationships with the men who